Good evening if it's evening for you. Good morning if you're watching it later or you're some other place in the world. Hello, hello. I'm Andrew Hill. I'll be your neuroscientist for the evening. Welcome to the Biofeedback, or rather Neurofeedback and Chill. Tonight we're going to talk about some brain laterality, left and right hemisphere stuff. Hey, Guy Soleil. Bonjour. Nice to see you. So for those of you who haven't seen one of these live streams before, the general format is I will do a neurofeedback protocol and make it somewhat relevant to the topic, and I'll explain the setup and some of the actual technique that's happening in the neurofeedback protocol. And then I'll go hopefully a little bit deep onto a topic or two. And tonight we're talking about brain laterality and some of the organizational aspects of that and how it develops. So please give me an audio check if you're live and listening. I have recurrent audio quality problems, so I think I'm being heard, but you guys can let me know if that's true. And I will set up a neurofeedback session, turn off the title and the timer. Okay, so I'm going to set up an eager session, and there's a plan button there beside my head. And what we're doing is a C3A1. C3 is the central site on the left, right here on the head plot. And the C strip, the left to right strip across the top of the head, is called the sensory motor strip. And there's a division between the front and back of the brain right there. And just in front of that is the most posterior part of the frontal lobe. And it tends to tie into a lot of the thalamus, deep into the brain, and then out into, out into the body from the divisions that are in front of the motor neurons that are in front of the division. And then behind that division, we have mostly ascending information. So that's the front to back organization. And we often train on that location, on that strip, because of the cortico-thalamic and thalamocortical connections. And it's generally a good way to train the brain for lots of goals. So tonight I'm going to do a C3 left side protocol followed by a C4 minus A2. So C3 minus A1, A1's left ear, followed by C4 minus A2, A2 is the right ear. And so I'm going to create a signal or a channel of data on each side of my head separately and do a 12-minute, I think I set up. Let's see. Yeah, I'll do a 12-minute protocol, checking each of these features. So let me save that and go back to my... There we go. Okay. Hey, Joshua. Hey, Radar. Thanks for the audio check. Appreciate it. And let me switch to some wires and then talk about some laterality. So I think I'll just put the wires on. So, sorry, I have cats running around. You know how dangerous it is to do neurofeedback with cats around? It's one of the little talked about hazards. Cats and very, very small children get into the stuff we do. So I have some silver wires here, just basic electrodes, nothing fancy. And I'm going to take two of the ear clips and untangle them a little bit. There we go. And I have a bit of a knot in that one. There we go. Okay. And then I'm going to take two of the flat wires, which will be on my head at some point, and pull those out. And have a couple extra wires here. Let me put those aside. So as I said, I'm doing two sequential protocols, C3 minus A1, followed by C4 minus A2. But both of these will use a third wire as a ground. And so it's conventional to use the other ear as your ground location. And so what I will do is I will switch the ground and the subtraction on the scalp electrode, the reference nominally, halfway through. So I have these wires. Let me get some paste. I have some electrolyte paste here called 1020 paste, which is sticky stuff like that. And it's fairly easy to put electrodes on your head, especially if you don't have much hair. It's actually pretty easy to put on your head, even with hair. Finding electrode locations is better on my head. So I have some paste coating both sides of that electrode. There we go. And then on the right-hand side, same thing. So how's everyone doing today? Did you do your neurofeedback? Are you training your brain? Okay, so for the first setup, I'm going to do C3 minus A1, which means for my little whiz amp here, it's red minus black for the sockets. And so the minus is the second channel, the second wire, so A1, left ear. And then the green is my unspecified location, which is the ground. So when I have the wires in for the ears, it looks something like that. And then I'm going to put another wire on my head, on the left first and on the right second. So I have the yellow wire in the red hole, red socket, and that's going to go on my head first. Actually, I'll just move the wire halfway through. I often have people set up both wires ahead of time because it can make it easier when you're training just to kind of swap. But there's nothing wrong with me moving the wire a little bit halfway through. Radar agrees that neurofeedback is easier when radar's hair is short. Let's see. Is that a C4? We looking good? My camera's reversed, so I probably appear to be on C3. Sorry, I am on C3. That's what I meant. Just seeing if you're paying attention. So I'm on C3. Are we pretty good? I think we're pretty good. Too close to the top, maybe? Let's see. Nah, it's decent. I'm going to go for it. All right, and then I'll switch the wire halfway through. So let me get my signals on the screen. Okay. So I almost made this topic tonight an HEG topic, and then I ended up spending half the day getting my HEG device being seen by my Chrome browser. So I might be able to do something with software in the HEG landscape, hopefully. But let me get my training going for the EEG tonight. All right, so we have to have a begin, or a run rather. So let's run. Okay, pick a game, nice basic game. Let's go for highway. There we go. Initializing. So you can see it says initializing. That's the amplifier waking up. Okay, so I have some signals coming off my head. So these are live signals. You can tell because when I move, we get some noise. That's one of the reasons we have those lines on top and below the raw signal at the top of the screen. It's to filter out the movement and the blinks and things. So if I clench my jaw or cause too much movement, it will blow past those guidelines, those artifact threshold lines. And if you notice below that, it's getting in the way of the other bands as well. So what I'm doing here, let me get some focus on the screen. What I'm doing is filtering out. So this, let me actually do one little thing here. I'm going to change some of the scaling and some of the thresholding. There we go. Oops. All right. Cool. So what I just did is I changed the relative size of the filtered bands. So the top raw trace has an average, a size that's about 40 microvolts. So I'm pulling about 40 microvolts of electricity off this yellow wire. And that's 40 microvolts I am creating. I am powerful at creating electricity. You can do it too. You're doing it right now if you're listening to this. And from that signal, that slightly noisy signal, a bit of 60 hertz noise, I probably have some high impedance going on my electrode, meaning I have some resistance. So the amplifier is picking up a bit of environmental noise. You can see if you look very carefully that the trace is a bit of a fuzziness to it. Let me scale that so you can see that. It's instructive. It's not a big deal for training to have a little bit of noise in your signal. So I selected the scale box. I'm going to go down to 20. Now you can see my trace got bigger. I'm going to move my threshold while I'm here down to about double the amplitude, so about 80 or so, maybe 90 now. There we go. All right, so now what I just did was scale the top of the raw signal and then move the artifact projection bars a little bit tighter. So now when I clench my jaw, it actually clips out the bands below. I'm adding too much noise for it to be real EEG. It's getting clipped out. So it's a good idea to have your EEG, your raw trace set up to be filtered so it catches noise and blinks and things like that. So then we have the 3 bands below. And this one here is 4 to 7 or theta. And I'm making about 20 microvolts. I want to make less. I want to train my theta down. So my threshold or the guidelines are set at 26 microvolts. So as long as my brain makes less than 26 most of the time, it'll allow the game to run. The opposite's true here. I want to reward this 14.75 to 17.75, which is a beta frequency. I want to reward that. So I'm making 7 microvolts, 7 and change, and I've set my threshold at 5.88 right now, it reads, and that means that I'm mostly outside the threshold, or the reward conditions are being met. The same is true of this lower band, which is a bit obscured, where I want to inhibit some fast beta. So once I hit F5 and begin on eager, let me see, is that F5? There we go. All right, so I'm running F5. I'm running eager. Let me get my screen back. There we go. All right, let me turn that down a little bit, kind of loud. That's good. You can probably hear a little bit of beeping in the background. So the way this game's set up, this is called Highway. The way Highway is set up is the blue that's sort of drifting away is the amount of moment-to-moment reward in the beta band. So I'm rewarding 14.75, you can see there under my head, and the amount of it's obscured a little bit by the game screen right now. I can actually make that, I think, a little bit more visible. Let's see. Oh, yeah. I'll just make it smaller. So just so you can see the information on the signals. There we go. All right, so what's happening is my brain is making moment to moment a bunch of beta, the green tagged band there. Right now it's 7 microvolts. Woohoo, go me. And I'm making 17.5 microvolts of theta. So whenever the theta goes down or stays down and the beta, the 14.75, goes up or stays up for 1/2 of 1 second, the way I've set it up, that will create a reward event in the software to allow the game to run. And so we get some motion on the screen. The blue band is the size of that beta I'm making moment to moment. The purple box is the amount of theta I'm making moment to moment. And the yellow box is the amount of beta I'm making moment to moment, which will also catch movement up until it clips out. So what we want to do is, to train the brain, is get it to move in some trends. And so after my brain listens for a couple of minutes to the beep stopping and starting, and the visuals moving in response to brain waves, the brain starts to figure out, hey, wait a minute, that information in the outside world is yoked to the brain's activity. And the brain starts to create little learning events, little desynchronization events, little bursts within a particular brainwave. So under this wire right now, whenever my brain hears a beep, it'll make a little bit of a swell of the 14.75 brainwave. There's this beta. It'll cause an increase in amplitude, which will show up as a desynchronization on something like an ERP, for those of you who are in that landscape. So you can see the learning event happen. It happens in about 5 minutes for most people, within the first 5 minutes for almost everyone. But people feel neurofeedback more like 3 sessions in, 4 sessions in, 5 sessions in this style of neurofeedback. There are other flavors of neurofeedback. This is the classic, the traditional style, often called phenotype training. although there's several versions of that. So my phenotype model is informed a lot by what we call laterality, or left-right hemisphere specialization. So right now I'm doing a left hemisphere training, and while my mind is not training, my mind is not trying to do anything, my brain is really doing the learning. My mind is getting trained. My experience, my resources are getting shifted. I've trained my brain a fair amount, so I'm already feeling this particular session. And what it feels like is a little tiny bit of stirring of energy, a little quickness of my mind, a little bit of wakefulness coming in, like maybe some coffee is starting to kick in a tiny bit. I was kind of tired a moment ago, and I'm less tired now. It's not that meaningful, but my beta's at 8 microvolts now, instead of 7. Maybe that's meaningful in terms of why I'm feeling more awake. But regardless, it's having a subtle subjective effect, even though I'm not trying, because my brain does the learning, the resource shifts, my mind observes it. And so it is this experiential process, even though it's not a voluntary process. Radar Ashwood says it might take 3 sessions to feel neurofeedback for the first time because you've never done anything like it before. But once you know what neurofeedback feels like, then you feel it almost immediately in session. Exactly right. So even after people have taken a year or 2 off and they come back and do 1 session, they feel it generally right away. And this is true even if the effects weren't wonderful. I get people here and there who've worked with somebody else and who did neurofeedback, didn't notice a lot, or got some mild adverse effects and stopped. And it was a while ago, a year or 2 ago. And when you start training those people's brains, their brains know what neurofeedback is, and they feel it the first or second time. You also, I think, feel it the first or second time more often if you are either really in tune with your mind, like you do a lot of work with meditation or creativity work or deep, subtle emotional work, or if you have crazy amounts of brain fog. Sometimes a little bit of brain fog lifting feels pretty amazing, and a bit of beta can actually do that. So people can do their session and go, whoa, okay, something's happening. Usually it's pretty subtle. Usually a few sessions in, people are like, hey, wait, something happening? And then it wears off. And then it's iterative. You get a little burgeoning effect each time you do neurofeedback, and you get after effects you get to steer. So changes in sleep and stress and attention build up and show up after the session as well. So between sessions, you have like a post-workout sort of experience that helps you guide the next workout. So let me put my notes on the screen here. Show notes, topic notes. Here we go. Move those a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about some brain laterality things. And when I say laterality, what I mean is left-right hemisphere organization. Now, it's kind of funny that I haven't talked about this too much yet, because it really does inform a lot of my perspective on the brain. I mean, if you look back at the other topics and talks that I've done in live stream format, it sneaks in. We have this left versus right executive function focus, where you have the stabilizer on the left and the supervisor on the right. That's the really covered pretty heavily in the talk on ADHD. So go back and look at that one. And I've also talked a little bit about the approach versus avoid conflict that leads to things like depression and avoidance in the frontal areas. And those are lateralized resources. But laterality is really more of a plan the brain uses to organize information and tissue. And it's somewhat conserved across people, not perfectly, but reasonably well. Even if you're left-handed, most of the laterality, the left-right organization, is very similar to someone who's right-handed. But there are human differences. So I actually know a fair amount about this because I got my PhD studying in a laterality lab. I worked for a scientist named Dr. Eran Zeidel at UCLA. And when he was a grad student at Caltech, he was a grad student for Roger Sperry and Joe Bogan, and was involved with a lot of the original split brain subject experiments, where they would cut the corpus callosum, the fiber bundle that connects the cortices, and look at how that really suppressed seizure was the functional cause. But then it created this sort of test environment where Dr. Zeidel became an expert in lateralized attention, how hemispheric attention works, or how attention is constructed and created within each hemisphere. And so a lot of his testing was looking at fast visual flashing called a tactistoscope with visual fixation. And by doing that, you can actually send information to one side of the eye or the other, one visual field or the other, and that'll determine where it gets in the brain. Because the eyes are pretty complicated. It's not that each eye goes to one hemisphere. Each visual field, the retina is divided essentially in half in each eye, and you have the left side of the retina is picking up the right side of space and vice versa in each eye, and there's some overlap. So the brain has to do this thing where it takes the visual fields from each eye and then resorts them. So the part of the retina that's closest to the nose, that visual field will cross, and the part of the visual field that's more temporal or lateral, that side will stay on the same hemisphere. And what you end up getting is hemispheric, so single visual field representation in each hemisphere, where the left hemisphere represents the right visual field and vice versa. So you end up with this fairly complicated organization. The laterality is not clean, not just left and right. And the same is true in the auditory system. Each cochlea, each ear transducer, each sound transducer is wired to both hemispheres, both auditory cortices, but it's more complicated than that. It also goes through the thalamus, and it also goes through the superior olivary nuclei, more deep towards the brainstem, to do a comparison about where things are coming from in space. So the ears are really complicated, and they're not well lateralized. The ears are probably less well lateralized than the eyes, because the ears are something we never use one of. Cover your ears, see how well that works. The ears never stop doing that comparison thing of where sound is, assuming that they work. And even when you're asleep, those little bones are vibrating, pumping in sound all the time into the brain. So the ears are very complicated tissues, but not a lateralized set of tissues. Instead, they're a bilateral tissue. And the ear, everything up until the brain, it doesn't have very strong laterality or left versus right differences. Within the brain, there are some differences. The primary auditory cortex is not lateralized. It's the same on both sides. But the tissue around that and just posterior to that is different in each of the auditory sides of the brain. So let's look at my little notes here. First of all, some myths and understandings. We hear about the left versus right brain, the logical versus the creative, the linear versus the nonlinear. Most of that's not true, I'm sorry. And most of the things that require the brain use both sides of it at once to some extent. Now, there are some differences. The left hemisphere is much more language focused, and the right is much more math focused. But that's not perfect. There are some shared resources of symbols and understanding patterns that are shared across hemispheres. So we think of it in terms of language and sensory systems, where this left front is productive language and the back left is receptive language, and connecting them is the arcuate fasciculus, this bow-shaped ribbon. And we think of Broca's as productive and Wernicke's as receptive language, understanding language. But we know that each of them can kind of do each other's job. And there's an analog on the other side, on the right, that also does some language, but not doing meaning. Instead, it's doing prosody and lilt and sarcasm and humor and getting that nonverbal information. So when somebody who's autistic doesn't have great processing on that right Wernicke's analog, then they talk like this all the time, and they don't have good verbal prosody. Okay, so just to interrupt myself for a second, you can see my neurofeedback protocol says stage at the bottom left. It's shifted, so I'm going to hit F5 to move it to my next segment. And then I'm going to move the wire to my other side of my head. So the language tissue has this bilateral representation, just different things, where left posterior is receptive language meaning, and left anterior is productive language, and right posterior is receptive language, non-verbal information, non-linguistic in some ways. All right, so you can see I made a lot of noise in the screen there when I pulled the wire off. Most amps, you can get away with that. Hey, Sonia, good evening. You wonder, physiologically if one feels anything when they reach the defined goal when doing neurofeedback. No, most neurofeedback will be thresholding, either every so often or constantly, where moment to moment, the goal here in this case is to make more beta of some sort and make less theta. And the brain's going to fluctuate moment to moment and change on its own. And so the goal of neurofeedback is to set the threshold, set the comparisons next to where the brain already is, and then wait for it to flex in the desired direction all on its own. And when that happens, the applause, the beeps, or the gameplay is allowed to happen. And so the brain will react to that, and you will start to feel something often, but you don't feel the beeps themselves. And you don't get to a sort of like, you see here I have 4 3-minute periods in the screen where the blue is my points that I made. Each of those beeps built up a blue bar. And I didn't feel anything as those beeps happened, and I'm not feeling anything beyond, oh, look, it worked, when I look at the screen now. So, good question though. There are some forms of neurofeedback you might feel. And those would include things like HEG. You can kind of feel the process happening as the blood flow changes. And, biofeedback on the body you might feel as well, because you're trying to put yourself into the zone and feel something to create the change. And body-based biofeedback under like brain-based biofeedback, i.e. neurofeedback. So I talked a little bit about sensory and multisensory integration. Well, sensory integration anyways, they're very complicated and poorly lateralized systems. Let me kick off my next session here. I'm running an SMR protocol now on the right-hand side. Oh, let me change the reference and ground. So I'm going to switch the sockets for the subtraction on the wire and the ear. That is the ground. And now instead of doing C3 minus A1, left side, I'm doing C4 minus A2. So I'm bracketing the right side, and that's making it more of a right hemisphere specific protocol. Let me start this. There we go. And go back to your questions. So the speed of the brain is also something that changes both with development and laterality changes with the development. So Radar has a question about why does the left hemisphere run faster, which is true. That generally, I kind of am modeling it here for you, where my C3 protocol, I ran at 14.75. My C4 protocol, I'm running at 11.75. So I'm running a much different beta on the right-hand side. Now, this is called SMR, sensory motor rhythm. If I was running my SMR on the left-hand side, it would be about a hertz faster, about 12.75 probably for the equivalent effect. The reason is the left hemisphere is developed a little differently. Broadly speaking, the left hemisphere's cortex is more modular. And what that means is it has fewer sets of inhibitory interneurons sort of running between regions, keeping this region behaving the same. And individual regions are allowed to run a little more independently. And this lets them run a little hotter. A lot of the brain's development especially from like age 10, 11, 12 on, is inhibitory interneurons. From 16 on, 17 on, that's mostly what you're making is the brakes, is the inhibition. So this is why teenagers have poor judgment, but they grow out, they grow into it. But before that age, like 8 to 10, the brain's in a very different state, left and right, and there's a lot less strict laterality in terms of where language resources are and other development is. And there's a certain amount of flexibility, especially with language. And as we move through ages 8 to 10, the differences between the hemispheres become more pronounced, and the language tissue, especially in the left, locks down a little bit. And it's harder to hear new speech sounds. In theory, impossible, but there are ways to hack it. But this is the basis of accents, is that the receptive language tissue in the back left locks down a little bit. By the time the receptive tissue on the right, it does go through reduced plasticity, but it's still able to pick up and learn social information, because social information is not a fixed resource the same way that language may be evolutionarily. You may have the need to learn new social rules much more readily than the need to learn new languages. So if you hear a speech sound that's almost like one you know on the left, the brain's going to consider an accent, a version of a speech sound you already know. And this is how you can understand somebody from the next village over. But on the right, it's social. And so now the context might be changing, might be nuanced, might be rich, and might be interpersonal. And so the right has this job of integrating that information a little differently. And this is why the non-linguistic information is what's really picked up on the right. The right also does a lot more work in that Wernicke's analog with symbols around math. So we end up with sort of a right-sided math, or many of us do, most of us, a right-sided math and a left-sided language. Not me. I actually did some testing of language centers, and I found that I have 2 language centers back there, left and right, and no math center, which explains why I'm profoundly dyscalculic and can't do math in my head, like at all. It's because of differences in lateralized development. And, for me, it's because I'm a bit not typical. I'm left-handed, and there's a few other quirky things about me, perhaps. And this has led to a different brain organization than is typical. People are pretty weird. If you do a brain map with me, you'll discover that you're pretty weird too, probably. But we don't care about that so much. The goal is not to be concerned about why we're not average. It's to use the ways in which we're unique to figure out where our goals, our suffering, our transformation potential lies. So I found out in grad school, testing my language resources with Dr. Zeidel, doing something called a dichotic listening test, where you present overlapping syllables to both ears at the same time, that I didn't really have language tissue. I had bilateral, so I didn't have math tissue. I had bilateral language resources. So, unusual development. That does happen sometimes. That's not that common. I would say it's probably about, 1 in 1,000 or something that has that kind of phenomena. Something like 95% of people will have language that's mostly left dominant, and that's comprised of about 92% people that are right-handed that have strong left language dominance, and about 80%, or between 2/3 and 80% of lefties also have strong left-sided language dominance. And so the others, lefties, will have reverse dominance largely. And I apparently got both of the lefty flavors. Lefties are not very common in their development. They're kind of a weird case. So early development changes a lot of this stuff, and the brain speeds up, the brain divides, and then the language tissue on the left starts to really develop, especially locked down as we hit that 10-year-old kind of time frame. And from then on, the cortex will have more of a modular and a left organization, an individual job to do across the bits of cortex. And so you can start thinking about how those cortical resources play out. I've already alluded to it a little bit today, where we have the approach system in the frontal lobe. So the front left is approach, the front right is avoid, and difficulties with those systems will produce potentially problems in motivation or mood or feeling overwhelmed or depressed or filled with dread. So you can see these phenomena on brain maps, again, QEEGs, but it's not a deterministic phenomena. People are weird. So understanding your brain will help you understand if your brain maps matter. Understanding your brain maps will generally show you things you already know about yourself. So frontal lobe will end up being more about mood and motivation, maybe some aspects of anxiety and oppositionality as well. On the right-hand side, that avoid system in the front will have aspects of oppositionality. As we move a little further back, we're into that precentral gyrus area, the C3 area and the C4 area. And now we're into action planning, executive function, some aspects of sleep. But the left side is more involved with the sleep maintenance. The right side's more involved with general inhibition, which can be falling asleep. Let me stop and answer some questions. Radar is asking, what's the deal with different betas? I'm imagining Jerry Seinfeld. So what's the deal with different betas? Is it ever? No, I won't do Jerry Seinfeld's voice. I won't inflict that on you. Is it ever appropriate to train up high beta? What about that middle range of 18 to 22 or so? I rarely see people train that. Yeah, generally those frequencies of beta aren't your friend if they're excessive. And they're not the kind of thing you would see a lack of generally. You're going to see beta spindles up there in the 18 to 23 range generally. And you're also going to see beta spindles in faster ranges as well. Also, inhibiting beta at the faster ranges is necessary to avoid recruiting muscle. and training people in the wrong direction with body-based biofeedback. Because if you tighten up the muscles, you will increase quote unquote beta unless you're filtering it out, which is what I'm doing here. So it is somewhat important, but no, generally you would never reward beta that fast. If you talk to some classic EEG people like Jay Gunkelman, he'll mention that SMR can be as low as 8 hertz and as fast as about 18. But I don't think it generally makes sense to train up above about 15 to 18 on the left, maybe a little faster, and about 12 to 15, maybe 13, maybe 14 on the right, depending. But it has very different effects. And so you have to kind of learn not just how brains work when doing neurofeedback, but how your brain works if doing it to yourself or with somebody. You know, everyone's a little bit individual as well. So like I'm doing 14 points, or so on this right side, 11.75. But, you know, many people would do 11.5 or 12 on this right-hand side. And there's a certain amount of testing and seeing how it feels. You know, when you land a protocol well on the C strip, you'll get really noticeable effects on executive function and sleep, improvements in those things, feeling clear, feeling focused, feeling calm, falling asleep well, staying asleep well, waking up well. And you can kind of look at different ways the brain reacts to training in all those areas to get a sense of, is the frequency you're training proper? And so if you train C3, let's say at 14.5 and have increased waking throughout the night, well, that was too slow. And if you train CZ at 12 hertz and you can't fall asleep, that was too fast. So you can kind of figure this out a little bit with these regulatory strategies, but knowing that the left hemisphere runs faster than the right in general can also help you with some of these planning of tweaks. So going further back into the parietal lobes and temporal areas, we have social and sensory primarily. And one big way of thinking about this, you know, we talk about left and right for laterality, but in terms of the front to back, in general, the front of the brain is the inside self, and the back of the brain is more concerned with the outside world. So as you hit the parietals and temporals, even the occipitals, you're really getting into outside world phenomena. And while the tempoparietal areas, those junctions and just above them, which is the Wernicke's and the Wernicke's analog, which might be called Geschwin's area, I think it is. Maybe not. Someone can check me maybe in the comments. But these two areas that are a little higher in the superior temporals, those are more involved with this complex symbol stuff, a bit lower down and forward of that. It's more about integrating. So you might see a bird fly and catch the shape of a bird in more parietal occipital, and then catch the color of it more tempoparietal, and the movement tempoparietal going a little further, and then understand it's a bird going even further, and then assemble all of that into a bird flying by in front of me in this direction, you know, this color, at a pretty high level, very close to where you would make the meaning of language, actually. So the part of the brain that makes the meaning of all those things, you know, that we see is right next to places where we make meanings of things we hear. So it's a very high level assembly of other tissues, essentially. It's association cortex. It's pulling in information from other tissues and creating an experience for us. But it's doing that from both lower level primary tissue that are receiving information from transducers, as well as tissue that's coloring and shading and interpreting and adding memory sometimes to that information. So it's really complicated. But in terms of left-right, let's get through a few more pieces here. I mentioned the cortical resources, handedness. Yeah, most lefties do have typical language lateralization. It's a small percent, about 8% who don't. And most righties have typical language lateralization. Again, one would assume it's about 8% or fewer who don't. Most lefties are not reversed righties. They're just atypically lateralized. So it's hard to say what's happening in the brain of a lefty. You can think of a righty kind of like New York City and a lefty like Boston. You know, in a lefty, you lay down a bunch of cities and then or neighborhoods, and then you run track or run streets. But in New York City, the plan gets much more adhered to as you develop areas. So one of the consequences of that is that the left-hander's brain, the left versus right aspects, are a little bit different. And, you know, in me, for instance, I have 2 language areas, but you'll get other differences as well. And you tend to have an increase of other neurodivergence if you're left-handed. You're about 3 times as likely to have other flavors of neurodivergence if you're lefty. Now, lefties are about 10% of people, maybe a few more percentage. It's hard to know. Just like lefties are not reversed righties, you are going to have some righties that are reverse lefties and don't know it. So there's, probably something like 12 to 15% of overall people have atypical hemispheric lateralization with motor atypical lateralization as well. But rarely is that a mirrored person. That's somewhat rare, actually, have a mirrored person. You can have it in identical twins, but even then it's somewhat rare. So the handedness doesn't impact laterally all that much, except that handedness or motor systems, which are reversed, your motor and your sensory systems in the cortex are largely reversed. So my right hand is controlled by and is felt by my left hemisphere primarily. And that stuff's pretty lateralized. The visual system stuff is, but the brain sort of combines the two sides to make one image. Unless your executive function is thrown off or your eyes are, and then you'll see two images. It can be really hard to have a surgery on your eyes later in life, because then you might change the angle and then have a double image phenomena, and the tissue back there, all the way in the back, occipital primary tissue, is really not that excited to change after about 6 months of age. It locks down very early in life because things you see don't change. Just like auditory stuff locks down at 9 or 10, because by that point you've heard all the languages in the villages around you, in theory. And so you don't have to learn new languages. You can learn accents instead, perhaps. So, these are all developmental things. But the left-right hemisphere aspects and language also interact. So if you are learning multiple languages, then you will have a little bit more of a bilateral representation of language, just a little bit more. If you learn those at before age, let's say 9, you'll still end up with most of your languages. Let's say it's English and Spanish. They'll be mostly on the left-hand side if you're learning them at the same time early in life. But if you learn your second language after age 9 or 10, it'll end up in the other hemisphere, in the right hemisphere. And so you'll end up with like your second language in the right front and your native language, your milk tongue, in the left front. And that can be kind of cool. If you end up with a stroke and it blows out one language, you'll be left with the other one intact. Or if you're tired and having trouble with word finding, you can reach through the other language and find something very quickly, because the hemispheres are timed a little differently, and the left one slowing down won't be felt the same way as the one on the right. So, this can be interesting. Also, having some bilateral language representation will happen throughout life. So it starts off strongly lateralized, often with, vocabulary essentially in that left front area. But the older you get and the more language you hear, the more you get a sorting into the right hemisphere of some of that language. And not a lot, but women do it a lot more. And some people who have really unusual laterality do it even more. I believe there's research showing that women are about 20-30% more bilateral in language representation, and will sort the language into bilateral storage faster and more reliably than men over their lives. So this is one reason why women are much less likely to lose language with a stroke, because they're left with some of the language intact. Also, people that are left-handed will have, again, atypical language laterality. People that are gay have some atypical brain laterality in general. Actually, you can see some changes in some brains. Again, that's not one type of person, but some aspects of being neurodivergent, and that's a category. There's different developmental signatures that will show up. So, you'll have this phenomena where language shapes the brain, but then the language you've developed will over time reshape the brain. So I mentioned sex and gender with aging. Also with this stroke prevention, you'll end up this bilateral representation helps with resisting the loss of language with stroke. But it actually might be even better than that. There's a direct correlation with how much you know for semantic information, things like the meaning of words and facts and basic ideas. That is actually a protectant against brain aging, and that is among the very few brain resources that increases lifelong. So the semantic content is generally, except in the case of pathological aging, knowledge always goes up. And so your richness, your wisdom, your ability to understand words and know vocabulary just goes up and up and up. And that will protect your brain over time. So try to learn a lot. And especially if you're getting a little older, it'll end up being deposited all over the place as you learn. All right, some more questions. Guy Soleil says, I can't do math either. Will this work? Will neurofeedback work for dyscalculia? Probably not. My theory on dyscalculia or acalculia is that people may be lacking the actual tissue for it. You know, the symbols are not that tight in math. I mean, for me, math is like the idea of what a number is has always seemed like more like a suggestion, a concept, and never a hard, discrete thing. And I had to learn my times tables when I was a kid by creating little characters for each number and then like what family they would create when they got together, because I just couldn't figure out the sort of symbol manipulation, the actual discrete math stuff. It's not that uncommon. It's probably about as common as dyslexia, but because language is so much more critical than math for humans, I think we probably don't notice the dyslexia, the dyscalculia, acalculia that much. One way to know you have acalculia is you can do higher math, things like calculus or equations, but you can't do simple math, addition, subtraction. And also with acalculia, you will generally have really solid skills in estimation because you had to work around the lack of discrete math. And then, you know, people like me who get some extra language boost from it, you'll see other phenomena, but you'll see other quirky things too, like stuttering and auditory processing difficulties. So those tissues are pretty complicated and tied into a lot of that input from the outside world. So you'll see sometimes significant features in the brain that look a little quirky. Now, we can't spot dyscalculia or dyslexia really well in brain maps, but when someone's a kid, we will run them against a population of other people, other kids that have learning disabilities. And that'll usually get tripped by dyslexia type phenomena, nonverbal learning issues, etc. Every so often we get a dyscalculia or acalculia person tripping it, but usually we don't see that type of phenomenon. It's just not that common enough for there to be a database signature, I think, at least not one that we've narrowed down. More questions here. Hey, Bonnie, nice to see you. That's really interesting. Thank you. Was just hearing via a mom about an 11-year-old attention issues, spacey on math only, not other topics. And you mentioned neurofeedback. Yeah. So spacing out when doing math, but not reading or not other low intensity things is a sign of dyscalculia maybe, or acalculia. And what might be happening is the person is working something really hard and it's low intensity, but reading is easier perhaps. And so it remains sort of like yummy. It remains appetitive because it's not such high intensity effort with low intensity stimulus. And math becomes high intensity effort with low intensity stimulus. So it's a hard thing to wrap your mind around and grab and hold. And that might lead to kids browning out when doing focus-based tasks. Radar Ashwood says, does inhibiting high beta help reduce arousal? Yeah, but like anxiety and overactivation, absolutely. Yeah, it does. One of the classic pain protocols on the right-hand side, you can tune the high inhibit. Classic high inhibits for like C4, C4 minus A2 alpha is a pain style approach for some clinicians. I use it with great success. And I find that I can tune the upper frequency range between, classically it was used, I think by this sort of arousal model people I was taught by 20 years ago, 15 to 30 hertz was the high inhibit. I find I can use 18 to 32, 18 to 30, 22 to 34, and can move the high inhibit around based on where the person's beta actually might need support if the pain is not really, really acute. Because if you do inhibit 15 to 30 on the right-hand side, you're going to create a quelling of beta, absolutely. And it's quieting internally. And it does knock down pain. But it also like knocks down thoughts a little bit. You know, it's a little sedating or a little dulling perhaps. So you got to kind of find where you might want to inhibit and not inhibit more is sort of my thought. And one way you can do that is by looking at the 1 hertz wide bins, the more narrow divisions on a brain map. If you do a good QEEG, you'll have not just bands like beta, theta, alpha, but bins, 1 hertz wide, 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, hertz, all the way through up to 40. And you can see where different frequency ranges are most excessive within which narrow hertz ranges. So I would use those to design your protocols, especially at that high inhibit level. Sonia's got a question. Can cognitive capability be improved by neurofeedback? How about IQ? Yeah, generally it can. Executive function is massively improved by neurofeedback for most people, and so is anxiety, which has a big impact on cognitive stuff. So is mood, the approach system, the motivation, that has a big impact. Speed of processing. I have a whole talk on biohacking intelligence. You should go watch that one. But the whole crux of that is the speed of processing is the thing that scaffolds IQ largely. And there are papers showing, there's a couple of them showing changes in groups of adolescents between 1/2 of a standard deviation and 1.5 standard deviations on a bell curve. Pretty significant changes. And in terms of alpha speed, if there is something in the way, if fatigue or stress or concussions is in the way, or even big things like ADHD or developmental stuff, I usually see the alpha speed change by that standard deviation or more every couple of months. So I'm pretty confident that we are getting really large changes in IQ, but I'm not doing a lot of personal like whisk and waste style IQ tests in Stanford Binet, but we are seeing a lot of, I'm overtraining here. We are seeing a lot of resource changes in people that are broad. Okay, so I must have hit F4 at some point because I'm now more than half an hour in, which means I did 18 minutes plus. This can happen with Eager. One of the gotchas. Let me stop my session. Just saw 36 minutes. Where's my mouse? There we go. All right. So in Eager, if you hit F4 instead of F5, it will manually advance to the next session, just like F5 will if you're between them, but it also voids the timer. So you can see instead of doing 12 sessions, 12 segments like I meant to, I started a 13th one. Actually, no, sorry, I meant to do 8, and I did 12. So I did a full 24 minutes of C4 minus A2. It's fine. It's just a full training session. Let me grab a bit of a tissue here, and I can clean up some paste while I'm talking to you guys a bit more. So yes, Sonia, usually my perspective on IQ is yes, but it's also complicated because while it is usually a single resource or two, you got to figure out what's in the way. You don't necessarily want to go after the same goal for everyone. If someone's alpha is already fast and you speed it up, you end up with anxiety. So you got to figure out why someone's cognitive stuff is not where you want it, and then you'll know where to gently help provide some support for transformation. Radar says, problem with IQ testing clients is retest effects. So if you do a study showing an increase in IQ, people just say, yeah, but there are other phenomena that also change along with that. Like the alpha speed does not have a test-retest increase and a CPT. Good executive functions will not just do like card sorting tasks and picture story tasks. They'll actually do things that are fairly rigorous, like reaction time, inhibitory conflict, like the Stroop test, etc. Speed of processing, simple reaction time, stop signal response, go, no go. These things will actually all change. So yes, some of the more complex executive function testing, attention testing, has a test-retest practice effect if you do it in less than about 5 years because of memory. But digit span doesn't, and reaction time doesn't, and all kinds of other things that do also change and do feed into IQ. Those are really measurable physiological changes. So I'm convinced, you can be too. Go look at the couple of papers we can find on IQ. Oh, sorry, Brad, I skipped this question. Do you ever have people inhibit 16 to 34? I don't know if I've ever used that range. I mean, I might have. Depend where on the head, depend why. And they would have to have an excess between 16 and 20 something for me to inhibit that broadly. That's a pretty broad inhibit. Got to be a reason for it. I wouldn't just do it willy-nilly. That might land weirdly if you didn't do it at the right location in the head, and if they didn't already have a need for squashing beta spindles in that upper teen range. It could be kind of adverse, could really cause some dullness. It could disrupt sleep. It could make people feel kind of like out of touch. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd do that range unless someone really needed it. Sonia says she should have studied neuroscience, neurofeedback, interesting subjects. You still got time, you know? I started my PhD at 35. You can start school whenever you want, you know? How old are you going to be in 5 years if you don't start more school? And neurofeedback is one of those practices where you can learn it and study it without having to formally study it. I mean, lots of people on this talk are biohackers who self-train. So you can learn about your brain. You can learn the neuroscience. Come get a brain map with us. Well, you know, we have very low-cost brain mapping. I'll segue into my plug for low-cost brain mapping. Come to Peak Brain. We have offices in New York City, St. Louis, Orange County, California, Los Angeles, California. And discount brain maps, $250, gets you a full year of access for brain maps for QEEGs at any of our offices. You can also take $250 off a full program. Instead, if you're not near one of the offices, you can do a remote program. Those are a little more expensive, but they do include the QEEGs. And if you want to use the same discount, the folks over in our European offices and UK office will also give you the same discount. And you know, if you're not in one of those locations, let us know. Maybe we can find a partner to work with you either way. Who knows? We do have partners popping up in different parts of the US and overseas. So I'll be announcing more locations later on this year, but there's a handful of others that will be open under our brand in the next few months. And if you want to participate in one of our network groups or come to one of our offices and train or do a full remote program, please feel free to book a call with me. You can go to the website, the Peak Brain Institute website, and there's a contact us and a link to book calls. So please just give me a shout. Happy to chat with you about your brain goals and about what this stuff can show for you. So let's see what else. Any other questions here? El Chatterino, potential. Yes. Yeah, we have some potential in these resources. We absolutely do. So, hey, we're hitting the end of our hour. Unless there's other questions, you guys can lay them on me now, and I'll do my best to answer anything else. Otherwise, maybe next week I'll show you some HEG or do some other topic. I have a few topics that I'm back burnering, trying to find the best way to explain them all. So if there's something you've been interested in learning about your brain, about someone else's brain, about biohacking, about aging, about neuroscience in general, please feel free to go ahead and leave that in the comments. If you're watching this live, please do me a favor and like and subscribe to the channel. If you guys could boost the channel a little bit, find a video, leave a comment, give a like, maybe share it on another platform that tends to bring huge eyeballs. The YouTube algorithm gods love that attentional sacrifice. That'd be great. All right, guys. Well, you have a lovely evening or morning or wherever it happens to be where you are. Take care of those brains. I will talk to you in a week or so. Take care.